to my non-defense defense. It's such a, it feels very anticipatory. I feel the anticipation isn't near you. So I want to present to you the thesis that I've been working on for so long in this unique and a little bit off track type of way, which I guess for those who know me is not a surprise, that I decided to defend even though the thesis was rejected. But we can talk a little bit more. So what my plan is that I will present the work and you can come in. There's a lot to it, so I tried to limit it. I don't know if it worked, but I may skip through some slides. And of course, there's the overlying cloud of the process of how this thing got rejected and all the things that, well, basically the process, which is also part of the PhD. So I'll try to put some of that in there, but maybe we'll leave that for the discussion. If there's questions, and we can get into that. Come in, Margaret. Thank you. Absolutely. Now it's complete. Now we're complete. So, let's start, shall we? Extending Dissonance is the name of the thesis and my experience of the PhD. An extended period of dissonance. And first, I'll give you a little background on why dissonance. So, by the way, Lisbeth, if you can admit the people that come.
I do.
You do. Okay, good job. So why dissonance? So it all started back in, first of all, what is dissonance? So dissonance is what happens when new perspectives clash with old perspectives or existing realities, which is happening all the time. To get a new reality or a new perspective that sometimes comes into conflict with your existing reality. And what do we do? So this happened to me in a big way in 2013 when I was together with a man that we broke up with. The new man is here today, so it's a happy story again. But we broke up in 2013, and it just launched this process of dissonance in my life where I had this new reality to deal with. And in cognitive dissonance theory, so I'll put a little bit of theory in because it is a PhD presentation after all. And cognitive dissonance theory says that when you have this cognitive discrepancy or this dissonance, our motivation is to want to reduce the dissonance. So that's the immediate thing that happens when you experience a little bit of dissonance. But the question is, the question that I was asking at the time was, what happens if you can't or do not reduce the dissonance, if you can't do it? So at the time of this boyfriend breakup, I was new to Copenhagen. I couldn't really reduce the dissonance in the ways that we are used to because I couldn't really I didn't really have a fixed job, so I couldn't really replace the job. I wasn't going to just replace the boyfriend right away. Those are dissonance reduction strategies. And so it left me actually in this period of dissonance where, because I was in this new community, I had not so much to fall back on. So I was kind of forced to be lingering for a while in the unknown, which ended up being a really amazing life experience, but it took a while to realize that. So at the time, I also participated in a democracy education method called Bitsafta. This is an Israeli democracy education method from a place called the Adam Institute. And the goal is to heighten participants' awareness of the rights guaranteed in a democracy and difficulties and dilemmas that occur when these arise. So it's a little bit in line with the dissonance type experience because it has participants, it's kind of like the goal is participants to go into dilemmas. So instead of arguing what's the correct way to do democracy, they're encouraged to actually not know or to be able to take on a different perspective. So in that way, if it also uses the group dynamics, and if there's a conflict in the room, instead of conflicting, like going back and forth between different perspectives, those conflicts are converted into dilemmas. So we can feel the perspective of our own and the other. For example, the dilemma between equality and freedom that happens a lot in democracy. So what I loved about Bitsafta, this was back in 2013 when I was a participant, and I really took to the method, also because I was in this period of dissonance, so I was open to such experiences. One thing is that it shifts the reflection from result to process. So that means instead of looking at the content of content, like theory, it looks rather at the process of how we arrive there, so the process of the group. The second thing is that it unsettles the traditional role of the teacher or of the theory as the authority. So you're not actually giving the class anything to kind of depend on as the knowledge. You're really letting the group kind of move through their own dynamics. And that leads to the third thing, which is that the content is generated in these group dynamics, especially in the tension between the individual and the collective, which is what democracy in practice is all about. So I love this method so much that I became a facilitator in it. I just had to, it was like I just sat in the facilitator chair and invited my friends and started practicing with my family and their friends and my friends just to see how this could work. Started writing grants to get projects going and started a little organization. And then got in touch with my supervisor Maribel at here. And I said, look, I'm doing this thing. And she was really interested, so we met, and she said, oh, there's a PhD position opening. So that's how I ended up with the PhD, which now I was thinking, what's the connection between Bitsafta, this method, and CBS, which is management education? That was a little bit my missing link. But actually, management education is really the study of people and how people work together. So there's those who are here and who are at CBS know that relevance is very clear, because this is all the practice of how people work together. So I decided to offer an elective course to undergraduate students, and it was called Between Theory and Practice, Self-Reflection for Responsible Decision Making. And the reason for that is because I also read a lot that management education was critiqued for students not necessarily aligning what they learned in terms of responsible practices with how they are in the world. So they may have learned it in theory, but in practice there's still this gap. So that's what I thought Bitsafta does really well, is connect that gap between theory and practice because of the use of the group. So I thought, okay, that's a good justification to do it for a business school. And that ended up being the data for this work. So I recorded the classes. The students also wrote reflection journals, and in their final exams, I asked them to reflect on their experience of the course. So that's like 10 pages of what they learned in the course. And really, I was interested in finding out the role of dissonance in this learning process. So the research questions for this work ended up being, first of all, how do they, so Bitsafta, you could say, is a way that you can purposefully extend dissonance in a classroom. So students are kind of subjected to an extended struggle or immersion, or however they take it, period of dissonance. So how did they experience this purpose? First of all, how did they experience this purposeful extension of dissonance? Second of all, what learning processes do they go through as they immerse in dissonance? So this was the second question. So what does dissonance actually mean for them? And how do they experience it in the classroom? And what do they learn from it? Can they learn something from it or not? And what are the challenges and opportunities of dissonance extension for management education? So to go a little bit through how I wrote this in the dissertation, I started off with a literature review where I looked at all the other types of programs that used something like, maybe not dissonance, but maybe uncertainty or maybe discomfort or something a little bit uncomfortable in the classroom. And I saw that there were these ingredients that the scholars pointed to, which were, first of all, the experience was very important, that it has to integrate your experience. So it's not something that you're not downloading information to the students from a PowerPoint, but it has to integrate their actual experience. Second of all, there was, in these cases, a focus on the problem. So sometimes you can call it problem-based learning or even case-based learning. where students are made to struggle with the problem and not necessarily arrive at the solution right away, but really focus a little bit longer on the problem. The third one, where some scholars work with, is emotions, where emotions come into the classroom. And those are often emotions because of the struggle with the problem and the experience. It involves also the group relations, and therefore emotions are going to come into it, like not necessarily easy emotions. It could be conflict, it could be anger, it could be disappointment and frustration. So these types of learning experiences also included emotions, and they use the here and now group process. So that means, like, if I were to ask you guys how we are as a group or something. And what's the goal of these of this type of learning experience? A lot of the times they claim that the goal was reflexivity, which is also a term used. So before I came to management education, I would just say self-reflection, and reflexivity is a little more pointing to the questioning of your own assumptions. So not just questioning of things outside of yourself, but your own perspective, yourself in the process. And then there was a term that I found somewhere halfway in that I thought would be applicable to look at as a kind of capability, like what are we actually teaching these students? What are we giving them as a skill? And I found this term called negative capability, which is the ability to be in uncertainty. So I thought I could, this was used a lot in management education, as like in leadership learning, how to learn creativity. So I thought I would explore a little bit this term because it wasn't so used or so detailed in the literature that I saw. And I questioned whether this could be a reflexive capacity. So methodology, I used grounded theory and looked at ways that, so how do I identify dissonance in the study through these dissonance reduction strategies? It was this abductive approach. So I used, I identified dissonance through dissonance reduction strategies, through difficult emotions that I was able to pinpoint, and group dynamics. And how did I identify learning? I used Mesereau, which he has a transformative learning theory, which starts from a place of disorientation or a dilemma. So it was very useful theory to use. And I looked at his distinctions between content, process, and premise reflections. I won't go too deep into that because time. But we can, if you're interested, you can ask later. And then, of course, my own reflexivity is really important because I'm both the facilitator of the group, the researcher in the process, and have all this double role. So I took that into account, and I'll talk about that later too. As well as ethics, which is, because I'm the facilitator / researcher, it's also very important to prepare the students and to take care of their emotional safety, and because they don't actually know that they're coming into this classroom. They don't know that this is coming. They just think they signed up for a fun elective where they can get a good grade. So they have no idea what's coming, so there's an ethical component too. So findings. So I centered the findings around the 3 research questions, of course, which are, which look at how is dissonance experienced, what are the learning processes involved, and challenges and opportunities. So I found also in this process that as I was looking at myself being the facilitator, I wasn't just facilitating dissonance in the classroom, but I was doing a lot of management. I was actually doing maybe more management than facilitation at some point. So that also was a little bit surprising for me to see kind of in myself in the study. And I found that there's these different ways that I tried to facilitate dissonance and different ways that I tried to manage dissonance, and then different ways that the students tried to reduce their dissonance. Is everybody with me? Okay. So one way that, for example, I'll give you an example, and now it's going to go through a few examples, so I'll try to kind of use the first one as our main example to delve into and give a little bit, just a little more superficial info on the rest of them. So one dissonance reduction strategy is pursuing agreement. That means that the class, when there was a moment of dissonance or discomfort, they would try to come to an agreement in the group. And as a facilitator, I would try to break that group harmony a little bit by pointing out that, wait, there was a disagreement here, so I would, if somebody disagreed and somebody tried to kind of smooth it over, I would try to say, wait, but there was a disagreement here, and just bring that to the surface. At the same time, you can't do too much of that and create a very disharmonious group, so there's also ways that I united the group. And I'll talk a little bit later about like when is the right time to do these things. So another dissonance reduction strategy is letting the expert decide, or also looking at me as the facilitator to show me, for them to see like, wait, what's the right answer, or where is this going, or how can I get to the right, what is right here. And to facilitate that dissonance, I kind of avoided my role as the expert, or them seeing me as my role. But also on the flip side, I also summarized a lot at the end, like what are we doing here, and just to bring that together. Dissonance reduction strategy, some people, when they have a little bit of chaos in the group, some people jump to take the lead, and some people avoid leadership. So these are ways that, just different personalities. And to facilitate that, rather than pick one personality, it's to emphasize that there's different ways to participate. And to manage it is to equally question both these types of personalities. Okay, and then avoidance, and then I won't go through every one, but for example, the last one, defending oneself, there's often this perspective like, even when there's feelings involved and people are hurt, somebody will say, well, it's just a game, come on, it's just a game. So then I would say, okay, who thinks it's a game, who thinks it's more serious, and we kind of get the dissonance out a little bit. And then also to manage it, take it to the meta level, like why are we doing this, what is this about? Okay, and then some of the ways that I facilitate dissonance is also by really pointing to the group process whenever I can. So for example, if we're talking about topics in democracy like prostitution or abortion or some hot topics, you could say, and students are getting into it, and then I would say something like, okay, please look around and kind of try to regulate yourselves in the debate, so don't count on me to pick on you. So they have to kind of think, wait, they have to kind of take a different level of their experience. So now they're not just expressing their perspective, but they also have to pay attention to what's going on in the room. And the reason for that, that's another way to kind of align theory and practice, because you're not just talking about democratic processes and expressing your opinion about it, but suddenly you realize that you are in a democratic process. And through these dissonance reduction strategies, I also came up with criteria for what could be criteria for negative capability, this ability to be in uncertainty. And that, for example, is, for this first one of pursuing agreement, the criteria for negative capability could be accepting disagreement. Now, I should say that this is not like all the criteria of negative capability are going to be in this column. Because it could be that someone's dissonance reduction strategy is pursuing disagreement. It could be the exact opposite. I'll get to that also a little bit later. So then there's these learning journeys that I mapped out in the thesis. I have 5 learning journeys that correspond to each one's way to transform their dissonance reduction strategy into a kind of a criteria for negative capability through their writing. And I'll go through Francesca's journey and maybe a little bit of Linda. Yeah. So, yes, but first, to just get a sense of like what are the activities, and this is not, I don't have like an activity for you guys to do, it says activity for you. It's just to get a sense of what students would be going through in the classroom. So you can just sit through it, or you can actually do it as you wish. We're just going to take a minute for me to tell you what happens, and you can imagine yourselves in it if you don't have a piece of paper and a pen. But basically, for example, if you were to work with a partner next to you, just work with the person sitting next to you, and the instruction would be, without speaking, draw equality. So just take a minute, without speaking, to draw what is equality. People online can just chill or whatever. Without speaking, draw equality in the library. Well, I think you get it. A plus. Okay, so the next part of what I would do here is give each student 3 cards, red, yellow, and green, and I would ask them to say what they thought about this result, like how they feel about this result. Okay? And I would ask them, for example, are you satisfied with the result? And they would say red, yellow, green. We can do it, sometimes I do it like with thumbs up if you don't have. So, are you satisfied with this result? Yes, no, maybe. You can put your thumb up. All thumbs up. Okay, of course, because we just started the group, so Lucy's experience. Okay, and then I would ask, and then we would talk a little bit about the result, why, what, and then I would ask, are you satisfied with the process? That's that 1 minute that it took to get to the result. And would you say green, red, yellow? What would you say? Process? And maybe you would say like, oh, too short, maybe some, who would put their thumb down? What would you say? Or yeah, what would you say? The process?
Well, that we haven't worked much together, and maybe I was starting off too fast, and just taking the pen, deciding that I had to go first.
Okay, good. And that would, and so we'd get a few of these answers, and that would lead to the next question, which is, was the process equal? And then people have to think for a second, like, was the process equal? What do you mean equal? Even though we just spent an instinct doing like, what is equality, boom, boom, boom. But when I asked, was the process equal? You're like, wait, what is equality? So you have to take again the question, but through the experience that you just had, which is different than taking the question theoretically. Now I would say, so what happened with Francesca's group, this sometimes happens in a group. I don't think anybody here broke the no speaking rule. Did anybody break the rule? No. Yes, you broke the rule. So then I would ask you guys, do you think it was still equal?
No.
So sometimes people say, especially this is an activity you do in the first class, and people say, yes, 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 it was equal, we're good, pursuing agreement, right? We're good, all is good, group harmony. Then I would say, but you guys broke the rule, right? So was it still equal relative to the whole group? And then they would say, a lot of the times they would say, yes, it was still equal, because anybody would have broken the rule. Anybody could break the rule. And so then I tried to like poke a little bit, but not too much because I'm still first day and have to be on my best behavior. But in this group, there was a point where I said, could anybody really break the rule? And then another participant, Leslie, said, no, actually, I wouldn't have broken the rule because I grew up in a very strict household, so it's not equal. So at that point, Francesca, now I didn't know this at the time, but she wrote her whole 10-page paper about this moment where she was like so annoyed with Leslie, who was breaking the harmony. And she says, I'm gonna have to read a little bit of text. She says, on one hand, I struggled during the class to question my own thoughts and to try to make sense of hers. Instead, I grew irritated and stubborn. I do not recall whether or not this was showing in class, as I do not recall the process in detail. I do, however, remember thinking of clever arguments inside my head and being eager to have her agree with me and thereby to win. So Francesca keeps going through the class, and so the class keeps being faced with these types of experiences where I kind of say, oh, but is it the process? Is the group democratic? Can everybody have a right to speak? Are the people who have English as the first language not more privileged? Stuff like that. I question them a little bit, and they get slowly more, a little bit less likely to just react, but they kind of take a little time to think about it. So she says in her final paper, this is Francesca, she says, my idea was that you could almost always look at a situation and decide whether or not it was equal. Notice how I'm writing was a lot. I have not changed my mind about this, but my idea has been challenged, and I realize that what is often a simple black and white question for me may be debatable for some. So this is quite a step to go from, no, we are all equal, to, wait, maybe it's debatable. And then she says, as the class continued, more conversations like this one happened, although I felt a difference regarding the matter I've just addressed. I feel as if the classes became increasingly open which I would say, did the classes become open or did you become more open? And that the conversations became easier for me to attempt to address as dialogues, even when I disagreed with others. I feel it became easier to listen and challenge my own opinions by being aware. Perhaps this was a result of the bonding that happened in the class along the way, but it could also be a result of increased self-reflection. Okay, and the next one is a bit long, but this is a paragraph that says in class. So the one I just read was on her paper, but in class she says, she confronts Leslie and she says, I said everybody had the opportunity to cheat, and you said something about no, and that helped my reflection because I thought, of course you can cheat. But then I thought if she really cannot live with her, so she starts to kind of understand this perspective of like, wait, maybe she really can't cheat. Then we do have different phrases. Now what's interesting about this quote is that then she takes it to a different arena here. She says, that makes me think about the exam. When we're talking about like how are you gonna grade us, and we're thinking pass fail, and I was thinking that's a bit unfair because maybe the ones that don't say as much are gonna, so she starts to apply this, what she just got from this conversation to the way that we grade. She says, this is one of the things I feel is kind of undemocratic about this. We all come from different places and yet we have different resources, but we are examined in the same way. So she makes my job a little bit more difficult, which I love. And then I was looking at negative capability as rather the ability to transform dissonance into reflexivity. So again, acceptance of disagreement. Francesca says, I can now allow disagreement instead of needing to win others over. For taking responsibility, there was a girl, Elizabeth, and through this process, there was an activity where she was noticing herself like watching the group, and she was judging the group and thinking, why is it taking them so long to make a decision? And then she started to think, wait, if I'm judging the group, then am I not part of the group? And so she kind of did this, like she really changed her reflection from looking at the group as the problem to thinking, wait, am I not part of the group? And am I not making it more difficult actually by not participating? Then there's ways that the group also comes to a perspective transformation. When I, for example, somewhere halfway through the class, I started the class and said, okay, should we do an activity? And somebody said, what happens if we say no? And this would not have happened on the first day, which is also a great thing for me to hear. I said, okay, if we say no, let's talk about it. What should we do? And then another group that started to question whether, I asked, is this group democratic? No, because you are the facilitator and we didn't pick you. Oh, but we can fire her. And a whole conversation about how they could fire me. Yeah, and then I think I'll just briefly say the last one and then we'll move on because we can take this up a little bit more in the discussion. So Linda had this defensive and competitive stance always, and then she realized, where did all this competitiveness come from? And then she also reflected on it in her paper. I did grow up in a very competitive house and in my culture, and she kind of took back that reflection and said, why do I always have to, what is this competition? Why do I always have to win? I'm gonna skip that one. So basically, I have pages and pages in my office on different diagrams on how I can put this thing into one diagram that would be the diagram, and I couldn't do it, and I had big papers and small papers and 3D papers, and I just couldn't do it, so I decided to do it like this, which maybe is why I'm here. Basically, the simple version is that dissonance could take let's say it could take two paths. It could be suppressed as its dissonance reduction strategies, and it could be transformed into a reflective process. Now, what's important, which I emphasized in the discussion assessment committee, is that it's missing the temporal and actually also spatial component, which is the practice of going that first level of suppressing the dissonance into dissonance reduction strategies is also part of the second level. So you go through that first part as many times as you need, and you take it into the reflection on the second part. That's how, it doesn't just transform into reflexivity, it's a practice. Libby has a solution, right? We'll get to that in the discussion. Okay, so challenges. So how do we know dissonance is transformed? So on the first version, so I've done this, this is a thesis that's been, is proudly rejected 3 times. So first rejection, the assessment committee pointed out that how do we know that the students are not faking their reflexivity, considering you're grading them, and don't they just want to tell you what you want to hear to get a good grade? And initially I dismissed the question, which was my fault and responsibility, and I actually even questioned the assessment committee's question. Not a wise thing to do. I just couldn't get into that question, because I thought, why would they be faking their reflexivity? These are people that I've gotten to know and that are sharing these intimate details about themselves and admitting that of their competitive nature, and I just didn't think that was relevant at all. Then afterwards, when I thought about it a little more, I thought, okay, maybe there are those who can fake their reflexivity for the teacher, and I started to point out places where that maybe could be done. And considering that's the data that I used for the whole study, I acknowledge that this is an important component to address. Now the second challenge is, so like I said, the dissonance reduction strategies that I use, like pursuing agreement, is not necessarily to be valid, to have a value placed on it, like that's bad or that's good. It depends on the group dynamics, and pursuing agreement could just equally be a dissonance reduction strategy as pursuing disagreement. No need to defend is a dissonance reduction strategy in this study, but maybe there is a need to defend, which could be just as valid. So the assessment committee rather wanted me to, instead of this type of critique or reflection, is to talk about why reflexivity is a good thing, and to show more the limits of reflexivity as being good. We can get back to that in the discussion too, because I think it's really interesting in terms of perspective mismatches. Of course, power and safe space have a huge role in this, because after all, I'm the one who's delivering this experience, and I have to take power and relinquish power and address the ways in which I'm actually going in to facilitate this whole experience for students that are not necessarily signed up for this, let's say. And also safe space, that ties into how to create a safe space for these students who don't know what they're coming into. And the question of how to know when to extend or to manage dissonance, or to learn to facilitate. In the thesis, I treat it as a kind of, there's an article, Facilitate First Thyself, which is once you see through your own dissonance reduction strategies, it makes it much easier to facilitate. But we can also get back to that. Okay, and the opportunities, as the third research question asked for, is it moves students from a place of reaction to responding, from reacting to something to responding, because they realize that their reaction may be a dissonance reduction strategy. And they can, once you reflect on that, that doesn't have as much of a habitual process for you. You can be coming more from a place of responding, which is what we're trying to teach management students, responsibility. As well, from the individual to the collective. That doesn't mean, I always tell the students that you, like, if we're doing a thing on inclusion, that you walk into a bar and you have to include everybody in your talk, but rather that you are aware of your role in as an independent mover to an interdependent one, and that has to do with how we use our resources in the world. And this one maybe is not so popular to speak like this in academia, but from mind knowledge to heart knowledge, which is a lot of the knowledge that was shared in this class had to do with sharing from the heart, or intuitive understanding of people, which was very hard to translate or to talk about and sometimes in this framework. Okay, limitations and further research. I mapped out a couple of ways that dissonance could go. Can it also take other paths? That's a one. Students could also be involved in the analysis as like a kind of a true intersubjective research would be. They would be not only the people going through the experience, but also help to then analyze their own experiences. The role of identity is a big one that I don't delve too much into, but of course I talk a little bit about how they talk about themselves. And I talk more about dissonance facilitation, but there's also a lot to say about dissonance management and how to create that safe space. Because maybe the facilitation wouldn't be possible without the safe space. And then, of course, I have my own process. So a lot of the conversations with the supervisors were like, well, what are the students getting out of this? What are you trying to get them to do? And I was like, well, it's the process. That's not really the outcome. It's all about the process. And so it's, the process kind of becomes the outcome. And that's what it was in my experience too. And then, in my experience, all the processes count, from the power dynamics of the department to the supervision dynamics to the feedback dynamics to the global events. All of these had a role in the thesis itself. Sometimes the advice was to put those to the side so you can focus on the thesis, but in this case I felt that they were actually very relevant. And then of course the 3 rejections are 3 opportunities for my own negative capability development, which is the way that the process, my own process was like living this PhD and allowing what I found about the students to also work in myself. And that's the last slide. Thank you for your listening. And if anybody has any questions or points that they'd like to discuss or anything they'd like to say, I would be happy to hear it. I'm an open book, so you can ask very personal questions. Yes.
Any deliberations that you had along the way in addressing, since there are lots of teachers here doing this on a daily basis, being in charge of creating safe spaces, could you say a little bit about your deliberations about that particular aspect? Because it seems as if you hadn't thought so much about it in the context where you generated the data, but it dawned on you later that perhaps there is an issue here. How have you thought about that, and how can we address that as being responsible for creating those safe spaces?
Yeah, so the safe space was a big concern for a lot of people, and it is a concern, and but also it's we as educators we also have to take some risks, right? And we there are some people that that some people that might not connect with this approach, but then there's some people that might not connect with a very theoretical approach. And so yes, it takes a little bit of a risk, and it takes, oh, my internet went down.
No, I think it's everybody's, your whole meeting is showing.
Okay.
I hope no one tries to censor. No one tries to censor you. We're shutting down.
might be a manifestation of my dislike of the question. No, but I think as the safe space is important, but we also have to balance. I feel we have to also balance how much protection we put around it, because if you take care and understand the students, then you can also take a few risks, you know. So I'm responding more to the risk-taking than the safe space. But for the safe space, from the beginning of the class, I tell them, like, this is going to be a class. You're not going to expect it, but at some moments in the class, you're going to start to get, like, you need to open the window, you start to get hot, you start to get cold, and that's part of the learning process. So I really tried to tell them that these moments that are coming, that they feel like, oh, get me out of here, is part of the learning process, and to just hang in there. Another thing is that the learning is not going to be obvious to the students until the end. So that's also something, every class they have to walk away with the feeling of like, what the hell just happened here? And they did. And so I would remind them of that too. That's part of my dissonance management, is like reminding them why we're here and why we're doing this. Yeah, so I have to say, in my 10 plus years of doing it, I've rarely had someone who just like walked out and so I thought maybe somebody did walk out in anger, but usually there are people who walk out in anger because it brings out stuff, but they come back and they see how it can fit into their reflection process. Internet not back yet. Yes, hello.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful to see what you've been doing. It's, must be quite challenging. But anyway, couldn't you say that the outcome would be more empathy
Yeah.
and more connection?
Yes, you could.
Yeah.
Could. Yeah, I mean, part of my thinking was also a little bit strategic, like what would be an outcome that would be acknowledged in this surrounding, and it's not like empathy wouldn't or connection wouldn't, but I wanted to kind of really relate it to the issues that management education tries to tackle. Yeah. What are we gonna do about this power?
Tilde went downstairs to ask if they knew that the power
Okay.
is out.
Yes.
On reflection, I was just thinking, because you've had such a long PhD journey, and the data collection part is the hardest one to do anything about. You know, you've basically done your field work and the observations, and you've collected the data. But now, when you reflect back on that, is there anything that you might have done differently about that, the actual course, the delivery of the course, I know you put in things to sort of learning outcomes, but they were maybe sort of small things. Was there anything about how you actually did the field work that you could have done differently, perhaps, in light of the things that the assessment committee was saying, well, what about this, what about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that the students could have been more involved in the analysis. That's what I put in at the end, because that would have helped, maybe helped the assessment committee also in giving a little bit more data as to the students' reflections in themselves and not my own analysis of it. So it gives a little bit, maybe it would give a little bit more validity. But in terms of the setup of the class itself, no, I don't think that there is something that I would totally do. I mean, I think it flows in a certain order, and it's a little bit different with every group. So it's hard to say what I would do different besides involving them a little bit more. Any update on the power?
Power has gone out for the whole building, so it's not just here. We don't really know the
Yes.
So I noticed that you push a lot of emphasis on process, but you also provide some other emphasis by measures. You also put a lot of emphasis on the capability, the negative capability. Can you tell us a bit more, elaborate a bit more on what is the relationship with this focus on process and capability?
So negative capability has been written about as the ability to be in uncertainty. It came from John Keats. He said it in a poem, and then some management educators have used it to look at how leaders are able to take this capability on. So actually, if you were to think of being in uncertainty as just something you have to get through to get to the outcome, it's one thing. But because I took that being in uncertainty as the process itself, I discovered in there that there was actually a lot to it too. It's not just being in uncertainty, like suffering uncertainty. It's not just holding on. It's not waiting for it to end, but it's actually making use of it and allowing this process of uncertainty to open something up. So I would say it's like, it's all about the process of what happens when you are able to, or you start to look into that feeling of uncertainty and be in it. So, yeah, for example, like when you first get feedback that's negative, you might say like, or you might, reject. You have all these ways to find an outcome, and if you actually stay in the process of allowing those feelings to come up, then I feel in this work that's the portal or the door to the learning experience that can transform and make you negative capable, meaning able to transform that into reflexive learning. Do that?
I won't say that, yes.
Yeah, yes, make it.
I was wondering, like, when you're using the terms like heart knowledge, like this is like a thing to say, like it's completely respectable way to go and do that. And I'm wondering what So I'm thinking that if we were to like use like psychodynamic terminology, there is a kind of accepted vocabulary around some of the things that you're talking about like vulnerability and presence and like avoiding things like transference, and sort of using a previous emotional state to try and manage the uncomfortableness in the present. So there is vocabulary around which might fill that in, but I think that you're hinting at something else there, and I'm wondering, like, yeah, all that's sort of accounted for, but what else do you get when you put it in this kind of poetic register that you're using?
I feel like you have the answer to that.
I don't know. That's what I'm curious about. Like, I'm trying to like translate into my schemes and like.
What else do you get when you put it from my knowledge to heart knowledge?
Yeah.
Well, when you, I guess when the students first come into the class and they look at you like, what am I getting from this? And some even are uncomfortable with that experience, and then some are very comfortable with the experience, and they understand that part of the learning is the group itself and connecting with the group. It's this connection empathy thing. So that's the heart knowledge, and it requires a little bit of a letting go of the mind knowledge and acknowledgement that like maybe the learning here it's going to be a little bit confusing because I'm not going to walk out with like these are our strategies for how I should manage this. We do a little bit of that, but just to ease the mind a little so that it's not total chaos. Yeah. But yeah, the heart knowledge is all the one that has to do with the ways that we connect and share, and yeah.
Yeah, because I was wondering if there was also like acknowledgement of embodiment in this.
Yes.
In a different way, because I think that kind of it's a very good shorthand to get straight to like, we're not talking about your ability to abstract from where you are now, but actually notice that you're feeling really bad, and like,
Yeah,
how you deal with that. Yeah.
Exactly. So labeling the emotions is also maybe a mind knowledge thing. So the heart knowledge is allowing the emotions and feeling them, and the mind says, oh, this is why I'm going through this because I did it. Yeah, so feeling it, and it's often not really seen as a type of learning. It's seen as something the learning is like when you understand it, but here the feeling itself is the learning, and it opens the door for the learning experience, the more general one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I just follow up this discussion because embodiment came up in my mind when you mentioned about this, to experience all this discomfort and then transform those abstract concepts like equity into those experiences and then transform into learning. I wonder whether there is like concept like embodied learning in this management education literature, where you can draw on.
Yeah.
Because I could also see there is a design element in your teaching when you put students into this discomfort. There is a purposeful design element in it. So I wonder whether you can draw some kind of connections between these concepts like design embodiment in the group dynamics, for instance. I've experienced this teaching when you had this experiment at CBS Learn. I mean, the group dynamic is a very interesting thing for every working group in different organizations. But of course, it also depends on the participants who are willing to be in an uncertain situation. For instance, people with certain backgrounds, or like people with mental diseases, you have to be more specific and structured in all these things.
Yes.
So you could say that some part of the methods and the finding are beneficial for some group of people, but not certainly for other types of students.
That's true.
So to speak.
Yeah, and in the thesis, and that's also a comment that's reminiscent of the assessment committee's comment that you need to map out also paths of other students that didn't necessarily get as much from the experience, and there are students that didn't get this kind of, the ones that I talked about were the ones that got the learning experience that I described, but then there's some that there was one student, for example, that he I really felt like he was there for the 12 to get the grade, and he was just watching to figure out how to get the 12, and he came to every class, and he always put down a green card because he didn't want to do too much, he didn't want to rock the boat too much. And then the group got in a discussion which lasted a long time, and I could see him like going crazy, like, oh, why are we like this kind of body language, and why is it taking so long, and just like get me through this. And then I said, okay, let's talk about the result. Are you satisfied with the process? And he put down green, and I looked at him like, really? Did you put down green for the process? Like, I saw you squirming in your seat. And then he was like, okay, maybe it's a yellow. Just to say that he was not the type, let's say, for this course, but he, maybe there was something in the class that allowed him to understand that he just wanted to like do the green and not rock the boat, and then that was like maybe a tiny little learning. But then there was also other students that didn't get so much out of it, and they wrote their final paper more about democratic systems rather than the group dynamics in the class. And that's also very possible, yeah. Not every learner, it doesn't appeal to every learner, it appeals to learners like myself, maybe a lot of learners like in this room because you came to see what this was about. But a lot of learners would walk out of there on day 2, which some people did.
I think it's about the idea of safe space, because the process seems like you have to accept a threat toward your beliefs and then sit with that threat and start to question your own beliefs. And it seems like it's a very social process, because here you did it in a classroom. But I'm wondering, because you have your own process, and is it possible to develop, or how would you work on this negative capability on your own? Because I feel like, wouldn't there be a very strong chance of going into these reduction strategies, or kind of masking negative capability as something else?
Yes. So you would reflect, so good question. So you would go into when you feel, or maybe if you tend to react to something. I mean, anyone who's in a relationship now, my boyfriend just left to pick up our son, but he could definitely say when I've reacted and then had to reflect on it and look at it. So any reaction that you have that's like maybe coming from habit, or maybe coming from an unseen belief, that somebody, even like someone's giving you at the beginning of the PhD, when people are giving you feedback. It was like, for me, it was like straight into my unworthy drawer. Maybe for some people it is too, but we don't necessarily open that drawer so readily. But for me, it was like, oh, ouch. So you can say as much as you want, like, no, but that's not what it's about. It's just feedback. But that's how you might experience it. And then the more you give space for that, or for me anyway, like that feeling, the less dominant, the less it has to hide, because it's just a thought believed in that becomes your experience. Does that make sense? Or, yeah. Yes, Dennis.
Yes, I was intrigued by your final reflection when you said that it was for you also kind of a meta experience, that you went through this dissonance process yourself with the initial and later rejections. So I wonder, when you think back of those times, especially of the initial reject, is it kind of initially, when you think of your response, is it like a dissonance reduction strategy that you applied yourself, or were you on a learning path yourself similar to some of those you described?
Yes,
and which one of those comes closest to the experience you if there's a pattern
in the refusing to the assessment, in not understanding or refusing the assessment committee's point about faking reflexivity, for example, which I just couldn't really connect to, and I thought that was just, in my experience, that was like, I just didn't get it. There was some kind of like pushback of like there was a dissonance reduction strategy there in the way that I mean, it also must have been hard for my supervisors, because we've been having these like same conversation for years. So there was some things in there that I was coming always from one perspective, and they were coming always from one perspective. So there were some things in there there was this feeling that like the assessment committee gave me 3 months the initial time, so I just really, I wanted to get it done. That's also not really being a negative capability. I wanted to do what they said and then so not really allowing that thing to open. And I shared this on Facebook too, like the first rejection pointed to some things that I also suspected earlier in the process. And so I thought, okay, I can actually, maybe I should have trusted my instinct a little bit more, and I went with that, maybe a little bit too much. I went too much on the side of maybe I could do this on my own. And so then I kind of took that back, and I had to take all the feedback into account. There was also this question of like, sometimes I felt like it was compromising the work to do the strategic, what the committee wanted, and I couldn't quite find that balance, I guess. I really just stuck to what I felt was the work and not necessarily always the focus that they wanted me to focus on. And I also feel this is a little different than my own dissonance reduction, but when I look back, that the way that the assessment committee wanted me to critique, so it was like a disagreement in the way they wanted me to critique and the way I did my critical analysis. So they wanted a rather more critical look at how I could force the students to come up with how I could be manipulative in the classroom, how reflexivity is not necessarily a good thing, like this kind of angle. And I gave rather the angle of, yes, there is power in the class, but maybe it's not necessarily oppressive power. So I tried to still give the critique, but maybe not the type of critique that they wanted to see.
But none of the 5 types that you identified in the thesis, these journeys that the students had, is in any way comparable to your own journey as a dissonance experience. That was kind of another type, it seems. Or would you compare it to one of those?
Yeah, you could compare like need to win. Like I wanted to win. I wanted to get it done. I wanted to win. I wanted to get the thing and to be right or to of course there was.
That's good.
Actually, okay. Good to see you. Stay in touch. Alex.
I think a very, very obvious question now is, one of your arguments was that maybe those negative capabilities are not really taught in business schools. So what are your recommendations? How do we do this?
Well, I was fortunate enough to get this opportunity to do this elective. This wouldn't happen now because there's so many more restrictions on how you can do electives. There's new programs. There's the numbers that you have to, criteria, the numbers, So this is a class that has to be a small group. It has to be 20, 25 people. And the criteria, you have to get like 40 students, which is fine because 20 people come in. But then that number grew and they didn't want to pass a class that had fewer students. So it's a hard question on the structure because the structure wants a delivery of knowledge to like ideally 150 people and we're done. And it's not quite the way this works. It requires a small group and time and space. But if the structure allows it, then it's very possible for, I'm sure, all of the teachers here that want to put in a little bit more time on reflection and reflexivity could use a little bit more space with that, which could happen if there was that. Yeah, it's not specific because it's like a structural problem, but it's possible.
Can I just very quickly comment on that?
Yeah.
So I think we do this on the PhD program, where we really have this kind of close, smaller programs where you have a lot of stimulation for reflexivity and thinking out loud, and where that's valued. I think the honest answer to your question is that we need to emulate that more, introduce that more on the lower levels, and here we have to work against economics. But I would argue that if you look into transparency, it really much supports that idea that if you have this kind of processes going on, you will cultivate this capability. And you could say that this is confirmed in how we do PhD education.
I have a question about the future. I was wondering whether you plan to follow up with these students in the future when they are actually part of organizations where they have to make management decisions. Because I thought, when I saw your diagram, I thought that it would be really interesting to know how perhaps their ability to shift from dissonance strategies to reflexivity changes once that they are part of a system, once that they are part of a logic that perhaps limits their abilities to do that.
Yeah, very good question. That's a good point to get in touch with them again. I will say that sometimes I hear from students like years after, and they say like, "Oh, now I get it, what you were trying to do there." Yeah, and once even students who were very resistant to the method and made my job very difficult. One of them, for example, I can think of that she came back like 6 years later and was like, "Now I understand what you were trying to do there." So it's nice to hear from them after. Sometimes I see that on LinkedIn that they got these positions because sometimes some of them go to like the ones who are drawn to this class go to like HR and they go into diversity and change areas. So yeah, it's again the structural part. But look, the structural part I'm also an example of because I didn't get the structural support for it because look, we're here. You know, I'm doing a defense. Even though it's not acknowledged officially, but it's possible to do. So maybe that's also the way that being a negative capability can make you a bit more creative after you've processed your own stuff. They can maybe make changes, those students can maybe make changes that they're initially told are not possible. That's the hope. Yeah, Maila.
Yeah, I think very much in line with what is said here. I was also wondering and curious, super interesting by the way, that is really interesting work you have done. I'm curious to how to apply this in practice because I mean I've worked in different organizations and there tend to be, you know, in meetings or when you project manage, you get in the same type of conflicts and you kind of sometimes lose your reflectivity in those. So I'm wondering how we can use it maybe in practice in organizations. That could be super interesting if there are methods, and is that already happening or?
Yeah, you can invite me to your
Yes.
No, you can invite me in, and also I will say, just because it reminded me that if you're getting into the same type of conflict, then it's also something a great, like you can see yourself on the dissonance reduction, same cycle. So how do we break out of that? And that requires a little bit of maybe allowing or seeing through some of the dissonance reduction, but not everybody wants to or can do that, of course. But I also have found in my groups that like when somebody does do it, then it frees up somebody else to do it. And you know, not everybody initially can or wants to, but sometimes I've seen that it's contagious. Yeah.
It's two questions. One question is a bit about your background. 2013 is a big year for you, and you discovered this, and it helped you, or it became a big thing in your life. So I'm wondering, what is it about, let's call it negative capability, or the whole process, which is important to you? And it seems like other people or education could benefit from this. Why is that? I'm not saying I disagree. In fact, I do agree, but I'm curious about your answer to it. And the second question is, what's next for you then in the future now?
Those are two separate.
Yeah.
The first one was, why is this beneficial? Well, maybe it's not beneficial for everybody. I should say that too, because maybe the process is not, it's not a prescription, right? If you're drawn to this type of learning and you sit in a classroom and engage, or you're someone who loves looking at group dynamics, then it's very beneficial and people really enjoy it and they can see it and grow. But someone who just wants to do things quickly and make decisions, it could be a very torturous process. So I'd say that it's not always beneficial for every type of learner. But again, it creates a group that is a lot more connected if you do get into some of these dynamics. And what's next for me in the future? Here I am. This is the future. No, I have, before I started the PhD, I was working on my organization, Madam Education, and I hope to just get back into that and get work going for, on behalf of Madam Education. I just put in a grant with Trugfunden, put in a grant with Nordea, put in a grant with Politik, and we'll see what happens. And then Mybert will hire me at Maus Müller.
I see lots of potential. We'll talk about that.
Something will happen, something will happen. It's also a trust. I mean, life wouldn't put me through that much crap, right? Something will pop out of it. Yeah, and it's also nice to be able to share the work and see how people respond. That also is motivating too. See that it's valued. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking you're probably selling it short when you're saying it's not beneficial for everyone.
Okay, so
Like,
tell me,
maybe not a particular articulation, or maybe there's different exercises, maybe there's tweaking, but certainly the idea that you will have to deal with things that happen that are incredibly dissonant and cannot be resolved by a propensity just to do something, like the first thing comes to your head, like that's not. I think that person would still benefit from it, but they're actually, according to your own like breakdown, engaging in the strategy in advance to get themselves out of the situation. Like I think they won't admit the benefit, but it's like it's one of those things. Maybe it's the wrong time. Maybe they actually aren't going to be in the position where they actually can take anything in. But I think there's more potential than.
Yes,
Yeah.
and actually, thank you for saying that. And after this dissertation was still going on through October 7th, which is also something, because I saw how much dissonance there was in the way people were talking to each other. Suddenly, it was, the dissertation took on a whole new value, I felt, because people were really speaking on the opposite ends. And I have been doing work with like Salam Shalom, Jewish-Muslim relations, and people asked me, are you going to do something? And I couldn't at this time, like at the really heated time, but it could be also now, figure out what am I going to do with this? What can we do now with the group that sits together through this? I couldn't figure out what we can do. And that's also something because we were so far apart, there was not even a ability to sit down and figure out what we could do. I ended up doing something for those who felt a little bit like lost in the middle. But yeah, it's actually very important for these times, and the more it's like rejected by these times, I feel like it's all the more important, which is some people have said about this work too, that like the rejection of it is maybe a sign that there's something in there worth looking into. Which I like that theory. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, Woody.
I'm a psychologist, so I really do agree with what you just said, but I'm also Tani's friend, so I didn't want to say that out loud. It might sound a bit biased, but I actually think that what you're doing here today, and everyone who is here has been willing to sit with this with some unpleasant emotions, because it's normally not done. You don't get your PhD, you don't hold a talk, and we don't have a script for these kind of situations. And I was observing the questions, and at the beginning it was only like family, it was only about the substance of your work, and slowly people started like asking about, well, how are you with this? That you actually didn't get your PhD. And I want to say thank you, because I think that it's you willing to kind of sit with all these unpleasant emotions that such an event I can imagine, also rise, and allowing all of us to sit in it. Sorry, I'm going to move forward. I think there's a potential for organizational learning, because I think many people in academia might not go just directly through the golden path, but the process has been, you've been through a process. It's been important in many ways, and acknowledging the process and not only the outcome is something that I guess all of you see on LinkedIn with these slogans. It's not about the outcome, it's about the process, but how do we practice that? And I think that it's a really, really precious example of how to practice that. And I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear. And of course, look what you did. Thank you, Whoopi. Yeah, and I also want to say my thank yous. Maybe I would wait until Andre gets here, but let me just say, because there's so much support in this community. I've also gotten my share of not support, but there's also support, and the fact that you guys are here. And Dan, really, you came through for me at the end, which some of you guys know the gossip. It's not an obvious thing. Yeah, so thank you for that. And yeah, it's been a tough process, but worth it to be able to carve that alternative path, like you said. So, thank you. Yeah.
You are very brave.
Thank you.
When I only went to EGOS once, and I went to the very new stream, which was system change, not climate change, and Professor Banerjee sort of led that, and it was very radical, extremely radical, and it was probably one of the best things I've ever done in a long time, and definitely my PhD career. But Banerjee, Professor Banerjee shared that when he put his PhD in, his supervisors basically told him not to do it, and that it would never pass, and because he was looking at systems change, and that he would never do anything in academia, and he said it really felt like he wasn't going to put it in. So he shared that experience. He did put it in. He did have a difficult time getting his PhD. He did get it, and look where he is now. And it was only 2 years ago that EGOS, the whole organisation, allowed the stream of system change, not climate change. But behind the scenes, quite a few big professors have been trying to get that through. So if you're into something that is not the mainstream and it's not business as usual, unfortunately, it's really hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
But just stick there. He stuck with it, and there'll be a reason why.
Yeah, and I feel like the reason why is already fulfilled. I don't think it's that I can become the next thing. Like, just the fact that I went through this and I got here and I recognized this is already a process fulfilled for me. But yeah, thank you for saying that. And now we have cake.